I took creative writing classes and stuff, but I feel kind of strongly that if you want to be a gourmet chef, you need to have ingredients, not just cookbooks. And if all you focus on is writing courses, you don't have any experience or any ingredients to write about.
Welcome to the Scriptcake podcast. I'm your host, Lavinder Gill, and I am honored to have the most prolific writer we've ever had on the podcast, Kevin J. Anderson. Kevin has published more than 175 books, 58 of which have been national or international bestsellers. He has more than 24 million copies in print in 30 languages. He has won or been nominated for many awards, including the Nebula, Hugo, Seamus, Scribe, Bram Stoker, Lifeboat to the Stars, and the SFX Reader's Choice Award. He is a creative consultant on the movies Dune Part One and Part Two, having written 15 books in the Dune saga with Brian Herbert. Francis Lawrence, the director of the Hunger Games movie, is set to direct the feature take of Stalag X, written by Kevin and Stephen L. Sears for New Republic Pictures. He is co-producer on the upcoming TV series Dune: The Sisterhood. He's developing a huge gaming universe with DeCoco's Alien Worlds. He has written numerous novels in the Star Wars, X-Files, and Dune universes, as well as a fantasy trilogy written with legendary rock drummer Neil Peart. Anderson is also the director of the graduate program in publishing at Western Colorado University. I don't know how he does it all, but hopefully we'll get a peek into the Kevin J. Anderson mind in this next hour. Welcome to the podcast, Kevin.
Well, thank you. And I even have time to do podcasts too. How about that? So, in my spare time.
I was surprised when you said yes, given the amount of work that you push out there, which we'll get into in a little bit. Before we get too far along, I want to find out, what was your origin story, Kevin? How did you get into writing?
I'm a big superhero fan, and we just watched Across the Spider-Verse last night. So I'm right into like supervillain origin stories. So origin stories. So I grew up as a kid in this little tiny town in Wisconsin, which was like something. I like to say it's a cross between Norman Rockwell and Norman Bates. It's a little teeny. It's like right off of the Christmas Story, the movie The Christmas Story. That's kind of my childhood. Mm-hmm. Little tiny town. All my relatives lived like within a block of me, and I would climb trees and help bale hay in the summer and do all kinds of stuff. And I would escape by reading comic books and reading science fiction, and my imagination just went out to the universe, and I loved it. And everybody else around me was like, had no imagination at all. So I was like the only changeling kid that kept making up stories and dreaming things. When I was about 5 years old, my parents let me watch the classic War of the Worlds movie, and not the Tom Cruise Spielberg one. That one doesn't exist as far as I'm concerned. We look at the old Gene Barry classic War of the Worlds. And when you're like 5 years old, I'm watching this, and that movie just blew my mind. That I was just so involved in it and engrossed in it, and I just couldn't get it out of my head. And later in life, I tried to figure out why my parents would have let an imaginative 5-year-old kid watch that. But I love that. I wanted to tell stories like that. I taught myself. I was reading comics. My mom taught me how to read. I started reading way above my reading level. I started reading the classics. I read H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and just started writing my own stories. I wrote my first novel when I was 8 years old on my dad's typewriter. It was like 3 or 4 pages long, but it was structurally it was a novel. I mean, a big adventure monster story. And I kept writing, and I kept sending stories around. I had my first story published when I was in 9th grade. And then I actually got paid for a story, $12.50, when I was a senior in high school. And I thought that proved that I could make a living at writing. And my parents convinced me that $12.50 in 4 years was not quite enough to make a living. But I still went for it. And I went to University of Wisconsin-Madison, and not in English. I majored in astronomy and physics with a minor in Russian history. And my I feel I took creative writing classes and stuff, but I feel kind of strongly that if you want to be a gourmet chef, you need to have ingredients, not just cookbooks. And if all you focus on is writing courses, you don't have any experience or any ingredients to write about.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to take Russian history and the history of medicine and psychology courses and political science and all things so that I knew how the universe worked so I could write things.
Pretty
And
insightful for someone so young.
well, it's because my parents forbid me from majoring in English because they knew I couldn't make a living as a writer. So I majored in astronomy to prove them that I could make a living at, well, that wasn't a very good choice either. But the cool thing was with my astronomy and physics background and even my Russian history background and by then I had published short stories and articles and a bunch of things. I got a job right out of college as a technical writer for a big government research lab for the Department of Energy. It was the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And suddenly I've got a full-time job with benefits and retirement and medical, and I'm getting paid all day long to write papers and presentations about lasers and supercomputers, and I'm working with real scientists and how cool is that? I want to be a science fiction writer. So it basically paid my living while I wrote my novels and short stories in the evenings, and I finally broke through. I published my first novel. I think it was 1987 is when it was accepted and was published in 1988. So I've been around for a while. And then a few, maybe 5, 6 years later, through working my way up and working with a lot of editors, they offered me a gig to write sequels to Star Wars for Lucasfilm. And that kind of blew up. I ended up writing 54 projects for Lucasfilm, and that led to my work with X-Files and Batman and Superman and League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow and Titan AE. And then I connected with Brian Herbert, the son of Frank Herbert, because throughout all this, Dune was my favorite science fiction novel ever. I read it over and over again, and I just fell in love with that universe. And by the time Frank Herbert had passed away. He wrote 6 Dune novels, and the last one kind of ends with Luke, I am your father, and just stops there. And it's a cliffhanger. And Frank had planned to write the grand finale. And I, as a fan of Dune, I kept waiting and waiting for Frank Herbert's son to wrap up the story. And finally I got impatient enough. And I had a lot of credits. I mean, I had 50 books published and things. Mm-hmm. So I just I found out his contact information and I wrote him a letter cold, just like pitching, like the line was, what you just heard is a shot in the dark. And I described my love for Dune and all of Frank Herbert's books and how much I felt that the story needed to be finished. And I had never met him before, but science fiction community is a pretty tight knit. Everybody sort of knows everybody. So he called me and we talked at great length and immediately hit it off and clicked and decided that we would tackle the project. Frank Herbert, again, I think Dune is the best science fiction novel ever written. I've just read it and studied it so many times. And Frank Herbert left big shoes for us to fill, but we had 2 feet to stick in them now. So we decided to tackle Dune, and now the second movie is about to come out. The first movie was huge, $400 million and 6 Academy Awards. Mm-hmm. Not bad. And Brian and I just published our 21st Dune novel in 26 years. So wow. We've kept at it and filled. Frank Herbert left 15,000 years of history to fill in. So we had a lot of places to play with. So there's my short answer to your question, Lavender. And we have no more time. We're done. So
yes, the hour is up. So you glossed over some pretty significant things there.
So I condensed them. It was the scenes from last week condensed version.
Let's go back and go from your writing as a technical writer, right? And then how does that transfer into a novelist?
Well, I was always really working on being a novelist, but one of the things, being a technical writer, all day, every day, what I was doing is combing over somebody else's writing and cleaning it up so that it was as clear and concise as possible.
Right.
We worked for the Department of Energy, which speaks English rather than the military, which doesn't. And we had to take like military in the Army, if they give you instructions to bake a cake, it says an egg shall be removed from the refrigerator and it shall be tapped on the countertop until the egg breaks, and then the fingers shall be used to, I mean, so you have to basically take an egg from the fridge and crack it open. I mean, you had to do that. And I spent all this time making sure that these scientists were writing their murky, complicated concepts were as clear and comprehensible as possible, and that the grammar was perfect, the punctuation was perfect, because these papers were what got them funding from the government. If they didn't do it right, then there would be millions of dollars at stake.
Right.
So that was a lot of great practice for me to be a writer. And when my first novel was published, one of the biggest editors in the science fiction field, one of the magazines, he reviewed it, and he made a comment that really stuck with me. He said that Anderson's writing is so transparent you forget you're reading.
Wow.
And I thought that was great. And a couple of my more literary friends were indignant. They thought it was insulting that I didn't have some flowery style. And I said, I want them to be absorbed in my story and worlds and characters rather than complimenting me on my metaphor or sentence structure. I've always, I don't want to show off my sentence. I want to show off my story. And so my work with, as a technical writer, just forced me to hone my prose as clean as I could possibly make it. But the other thing that it really did is I was not just editing these things, I was the publisher too. I had to design the covers to government specs, and we had to lay them out. We had to do the typesetting. We had to get all the artwork and crop the photos and lay everything out. And it also taught me how to be a publisher, which, as you mentioned, I'm the director of the graduate program in publishing at Western Colorado University. I've run my own publishing house, Wordfire Press, since like 2010. We published over 400 books by 120 authors. And I publish a lot of my own books. So just having, it was, at the time, it felt boring to me because I'm writing respirator safety manuals instead of galactic empire battles. But it really did put me in good stead to understand the publishing industry, to clean up my writing. And it was like a boot camp, so that when I got turned loose in the Star Wars universe, I think I could do as good a job as I possibly could.
What was the first novel that you had published?
It was called Resurrection Inc. It was a sort of a gothic horror, hard science fiction murder mystery, another one of those. And it was my first one. And it was inspired. I mean, I wanted to do this novel. I had written a whole bunch of short stories. And back in the day, sounding like an old fart here, but back in the day, the career path for a science fiction writer was you wrote a bunch of short stories, you got them published in the major magazines, and then you got around to tackling your first novel, and then you could get it published. That path has now completely been scrambled up, and people can go a million different ways now. But at the time, I had published a bunch of short stories, and it was time for me to do a novel. And I had this idea, and I had always been a big fan of the progressive rock group Rush, that I hope a lot of your people know. I mean, a lot of their music is science fiction and epic, and the lyrics were, I mean, I was this nerdy kid that was never going to get a girlfriend. So what did love songs have to do with me? And I was much more interested in songs about black holes and dystopias and quests for the Fountain of Lamneth and all these kind of things. And when I was developing my first novel, Rush came out with an album called Grace Under Pressure, which is sort of a big science fiction dystopian concept album. And I thought, Wouldn't it be cool if I kind of used a bunch of these songs that are just like my novel, and I fed in like a bunch of secret lyrics into the novel I was writing? And just for me, it was not a big deal. And I would listen to the album a zillion times while I was writing the novel. And all the songs, all those lyrics were written by Neil Peart, who was also the drummer for Rush.
Right.
And when the book was published, I made sure to put in the acknowledgments that this novel was inspired by the haunting lyrics of Grace Under Pressure from Rush. And I named the three guys in the band. And when the book was published, I got the address for Mercury Records, who was their record label. And I signed a copy to each one of the guys, and I just packaged it up and mailed it off. And I assumed it was going into like the warehouse with the Ark of the Covenant or something, and I would never hear anything again. But after about a year and a half, I got a letter back from Neil Peart. It was this 5-page single space letter telling me how much he loved my novel, and that if I wanted to, I could write him back and correspond. And we ended up having this close friendship for 31 years. We wrote several books together. We wrote some graphic novels together, and he passed away in 2020 after a long bout with brain cancer. But the last book I did with him, we plotted together, and I had to write it after he was gone. So that was, you asked about my first novel, but that first novel had this bright trajectory all through my career because of the connections I made and the other projects that branched off from that.
Wow. Minor connection I think we have is my first screenplay was inspired by a Sting song. And so,
I mean, music is just something that it's a very personal thing. I mean, I can hear a couple of songs by Rush and they just make me weep. I mean, they touch me so much, and they just work on it, and you can play it for somebody else and they don't get it. And so music is just something that has always been a huge motivator for me. And, it's maybe not something I can always share, but when I write it into a story, then, a story is much more comprehensible to people. When I do a novel based on something that music has inspired, almost everybody can get the novel. But not every, I mean, and the same thing. I grew up, I'm born and bred, and it's in my genetic structure, classic rock and progressive rock. And I could study rap music every day for months, and it still would never I just wouldn't, I'd understand it, but I wouldn't get it. And classic rock and prog rock is what I get, and it inspires me. And that's for me. It doesn't have to be for you.
Yeah, no, I try to find a song or two that connect me emotionally to the core story of whatever I happen to be writing. And one of the things that really helps me, get in the right mindset and get prepared to write is I'll listen to the song a couple times and I'll kind of feel the rhythm and the cadence and everything. And I'm like, okay, yeah, I had a tight schedule last year. I had to write a feature for a company in a week. They'd hired other writers to write it, and they were, close to pre-production, and they still weren't happy with it. So they asked me to take a nod in. And if it wasn't for the song that I was listening to, I don't think I could have written it that quickly. And the song really helped my mind and get me in that right space to write for that.
It's like the soundtrack. And like when I was writing all my Star Wars books, I had the 4 CDs of the Star Wars soundtracks just like on infinite loop. I mean, it was just going on and on. Because once you sit down to write Star Wars, you play that opening 20th Century Fox fanfare. It just okay, I'm in the movie universe, and that's how it works.
That soundtrack.
And then your neighbors go, turn that down.
All right. So you write, and were you self-publishing from the get-go, or did you have a publisher for your first few?
Oh, I always had major publishers. It was much later that it wasn't until like 2008 or 9 that the whole indie publishing movement became possible. In fact, I give lectures on, it's called A Perfect Storm, where like everything happened at once that kind of created indie publishing, that Amazon brought out Kindle, and a bunch of the major publishers folded, and Borders bookstores closed, and it was like all these events that just hurted a bunch of authors. Like, your only alternative now is to do it yourself.
Right.
And at the same time, there was do-it-yourself publishing, and you could do your own ebooks and you could get your own cover art. And so I picked up on that because the way the publishing industry used to work, and it still kind of works that way, is your book comes out. Well, it's like a movie in the theaters. The book comes out, it gets its day in the sun in the bookstores, and after a while, it's just, okay, been there, done that, and they let it go out of print and you take it away. And once the movie's out of the theaters, it gets its second run, but then it's kind of just there and a few people will read it.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a whole bunch of books that I had written and published that were now, this is like 2009, that were now out of print, and no publisher wanted to reprint them. And this included Resurrection Inc., my first novel. It was out, and it was published in 1988. So by 2008, nobody was buying it anymore. You couldn't find it anywhere. And I got the rights back. Well, by 1988, when it came out, I had like 4 fans in the world, and I was related to all of them. And in 2008, I had millions of Star Wars readers.
Right.
And they all wanted to read my first book, and they were haunting used bookstores to find battered old copies. And suddenly I had the tools, and I had a friend who was really encouraging me. He said, you should just put this thing up on Kindle. And he helped me format it, and we got a really terrible cover on it. But at that time, nobody cared.
Right.
And we put it up, and then we got some of my other old books and we put them up, and lo and behold, in like a year, I made as much money, if not more, than I had ever made total from the major publisher.
Oh, wow.
And we went, oh, I like this. And I started publishing a whole bunch of it's called my backlist. I mean, I had dozens of books that I had written that nobody else could find anymore. And then I started doing it successfully. And some of my big name author friends said, hey, that's a great idea, but they didn't want to learn how to do it. So they gave me their books to publish. And I kind of fell backwards into having a publishing house. And we started publishing all these big name science fiction authors. And the problem was it sort of sucked up all my time, so I didn't get as much writing done. But it was a pretty big thing that we were doing. I ended up having like 5 employees just working on cover designs and laying out and advertising, and so yet another reason that I wished I had like 5 clones of myself so I could do more. But
well, maybe one day. But
turn out to be evil clones and have to be destroyed, though. So we just
so you start publishing, and was your first book successful?
Yeah, I mean, I reprinted my own stuff. And then, so Frank Herbert, with all the Dune books that we were writing, but Frank Herbert wrote like 20 other books besides Dune. And all of them, every single one of those books was out of print. Nobody could find them anywhere. And I was a huge Frank Herbert fan, and I was working with Brian Herbert, his son. And we actually took Frank's backlist to our major Dune publishers, saying, look, every one of these Dune books is a New York Times bestseller. And you've got all these Frank Herbert books that are out of print. Why don't you reprint them and sell them alongside the Dune books? Well, they took like 4 or 5 of them, but they didn't want all of them. And I was very disturbed. And I said to Brian, well, they need to be in print. Why don't we just publish them at WordFire? So he gave me so we just split the royalties when it comes out. He gave me the rights to, well, I don't know, I think 15 of Frank Herbert's books. And we've been publishing. In fact, just today, I got a notice from Amazon that one of those old books called The Lazarus Effect is just today. It's a #1 bestseller in its category on Amazon. Awesome. And this has been 30 years. And we just kind of retool them and bring them out. So I'm bringing these books back, but because I have a small and lean operation, I don't need to sell 20,000 copies in order to make it profitable. And because they're on Amazon, people can just buy one at a time. I don't have to print up thousands and ship them to bookstores and everything. The technology now is so remarkable. It's called print on demand, that they all have the files resident, and they just publish a book at a time if you order it. Right. And that's what I teach my students how to do at Western Colorado University. They lay out their own books and they publish them, and we have book signings, and it's a whole different landscape than the way it used to be. I mean, music is the same way. That used to be you had to have a giant record label or you would never get an album out. Well, now everybody makes their own CDs, or they run Kickstarters for them, or they just have small print runs of well, I'm sounding dated already because nobody buys CDs anymore. That's just all. Well, that's not true, because if they're a band that goes and plays like the bar band circuit, they want physical CDs that they can sell to their fans because they want them autographed and things like that. So there's a market for that, and
absolutely
there are ways to do it.
All right, so you published the first novel, and then how long before you're not working as a technical writer anymore? Like how often?
Way back when. Well, my wife was also a writer, and she was also a technical writer at the same Lawrence Livermore lab. And my writing career started to take off, and then she started publishing books. But I'm a pretty conservative financial guy. I don't want to not know where the next electric bill is going to be paid. And I like ramen noodle soup just fine, but I don't want it to be my only staple in the diet. So we had a great job.
Like a true writer.
But we had a great job as a technical writer. But I really would rather be writing Star Wars than writing respirator safety manuals. And so because my wife and I were both technical writers, and because I had a security clearance, which meant I was very valuable. You don't just get rid of somebody that has a security clearance, because it took a year and a half to get it. And so the business I worked for was very amenable when I said I really wanted to work 4 10-hour days instead of 5 8-hour days. So I had one extra day to write. And well, I mean, I was really working 5 10-hour days anyway. So they let me work 4 10-hour days. And then it kind of went down to 3 10-hour days. And, they were watching my books get published. They were seeing all these things come out. So they were intimidated that I was, being famous writer elsewhere. And they were very flexible. And in fact, finally, it was my wife and I job shared for, we each would do 2 days a week or something like that. But I didn't quit my day job fully until we had set aside a year's worth of expenses in the bank. Just because another lecture that I give is called Black Ice, What to Do When Your Career Spins Out of Control, because there's so much stuff that can happen in publishing or entertainment or creative that in fact, the opening part of that talk is a few years ago, I was at a writing conference and I was on a panel, like, what would you tell your younger self if you could tell him anything? And one of the things I really thought about it, and what I realized was you have to get it deeply ingrained in your head that you never, ever, ever have it made. No matter what you think is going on, no matter how much of a bestseller your current book is, 2 years from now, they might not want it. Or the publisher might go bankrupt, or the Dune movie might be delayed 6 months because of the actor strike, or all kinds of things can happen that aren't in your control. And the bank kind of likes to have the mortgage every month, not like whenever you get paid for something. And in fact, that was another thing, that my wife and I were buying a house, and they didn't like the fact, even though I was a best-selling author with millions of copies in print, there was no like pay stub that they could get, monthly paycheck. There was no guarantee. And the mortgage company even asked me to see if I could get a letter from Bantam Books guaranteeing that they would buy my next 10 novels. And I went, no, that'll never happen. So, and since then it's been I can't imagine doing it differently. But there were some years, it was like roller coaster years where, and especially, and I'm talking to your audience now, especially if you count on the money that Hollywood promises you, that it is paid in bullshit. I mean, I have so many. So January is coming up. at the first of the year, my wife and I sit down and we kind of lay out, okay, this is all the money that we expect to come in this year. These are all the contracts. These are all, and then the whole bottom half is, and here's the millions of dollars that Hollywood has promised us that might change our lives, but that will never happen. And and it is that there's so much enthusiasm, and it's going to happen. And I'm going to be the head of the story room on this TV show, and I'm going to get this. Well, you mentioned my intro, Francis Lawrence, the guy who did The Hunger Games and I Am Legend and stuff. He's optioned a great graphic novel that I wrote with Stephen Sears called Stalag X, and it's like human POWs in an alien concentration camp. And the graphic novel came out, and Francis loves it, and he's assigned a scriptwriter for it, and everybody's excited. And that's been about 2.5 years ago. And then the writer's strike happened. So that, I mean, the option is a certain amount of time, and then the writer's strike literally freezes the option, and then you have to delay that. And then they'll renew the option as they work on getting the script done. And this is for a graphic novel that my co-author and I published literally 23 years ago, and we've been pushing it ever since. And my co-author is a well-established TV producer. He was the producer of Xena Warrior Princess, and he's worked on the A-Team, and he's got all kinds of connections. And even that, it's 23 years. Yep. Dune, which is the best-selling science fiction novel of all time. Brian Herbert and I we're working on getting that movie done with different studios and all kinds of stuff. That was over 25 years to get the movie out. And the Dune TV show, the Sisterhood TV show, based on one of our novels called Sisterhood of Dune. Well, that was optioned in 2016. No, it was bought in 2016. They were going to make it. They're determined, and they are going to make it. They're filming it. It's all going, but it's been 2016. I don't know when it's going to come out. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can't pay your bills on stuff like that.
No, I know exactly what you mean. When I sent my first screenplay out to a buddy of mine who was working at MGM at the time, it was when I was just finishing up film school. And he said something that I didn't understand at the time. He goes, wow, first of all, congratulations on a great screenplay. I'd love to be attached. I don't know what that means, to be attached. And I'm like, so he had to explain to me that, well, I will push it to my contacts, and if this eventually gets made, I'll get a credit like a producer or assistant producer or something like that. Yeah. I'm like, that's fine. And then they sent it to somebody, these two directors who had a fantastic movie out a few years earlier that were, big time. And they said, hey, we'd like to be attached. I'm like, okay. And they're like, we're going to send it to our agent at, I think it was at William Morris at the time, and or maybe CAA. And their agent was the top agent there. And I'm like, we don't have to send it to the top agent. How about we send it to a smaller agent? No, it's going to be fine. And a week or two goes by and I haven't heard anything. So I call up and my buddy goes, are you shopping? I'm like, for what? He goes, for a new car. I'm like, because you're going to make so much money when the script sells. And it was just this, I know it's just yapping, but there's so much allure and excitement and joy and all that kind of stuff. And of course their agent said, hey, I really like the script. We got something kind of similar. So I think we're going to pass and, not sign this person and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, no one's returning my phone calls. And that was my introduction to Hollywood. It's a tough business. It really is, and there's so much excitement and energy around every little thing that you do, but not always does it come through. I was just talking to somebody on another podcast recently how, when I have people that say they're going to finance my next film, it doesn't mean anything to me. Mm-hmm. When I get the check handed to me or mailed to me, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Make sure it clears the bank before you get excited.
After it clears, I'm like, okay, maybe it's going to happen. Like I'm not even.
Well, a friend of mine, Michael Casa, great scriptwriter who worked for The Twilight Zone and a whole bunch of other stories. The newer Twilight Zone. He said that the way you say no in Hollywood is boundless enthusiasm followed by endless silence.
That's exactly right.
Nobody ever just says no, that it's just like, oh, we love this, we'll get back to you. And then that's silence. And
well, so many lessons have been learned by people that have said no in the past. And then the person they said no to blows up. And now they don't want anything to do with you. And so they just don't say no anymore because they don't want to risk that. But okay, so you start publishing. And how many years was it before you let go of your day job?
I think I had 7 New York Times bestsellers. So it was probably 6-7 years.
Wow. That's pretty impressive that
My
you
first novel was 1988, and I think I quit full time in like 1994, 95, something like that.
okay. And how long was it before, not only how long, but how did it happen that you went from that to writing for Star Wars? How did that happen? And when was that?
My first, so I published, I think, five of my own novels, and they were critically acclaimed, which meant they got great reviews and didn't sell anything. So I had five books out, and then in 1993, I got a call from my editor at Bantam, and she said, "Kevin, do you like Star Wars?" And I said, "Well, of course I like Star Wars. Everybody likes Star Wars."
Uh,
And she said, "Do you want to write three sequels to it?" And like, now what I didn't realize is, so I did these other five novels, and I was working with Signet Books and Bantam Books and these other places. And I always delivered my stuff on time. I was always easy to work with. I wasn't a prima donna. I delivered what I said I was going to deliver to it was a book about this, and it was delivered at this time, and it was this length. And I basically was auditioning without knowing it, that I proved to be somebody that they wanted to work with, that I was reliable, that I wasn't a pain in the butt, and it might be a shock to learn that some authors are a pain in the butt. And they, without my now at this time, there was no Star Wars line. There were Star Trek books out every month, but there was no Star Wars anything. And so I had no idea they were doing this, but they thought I would be a good candidate. This is my editor at Bantam. And she sent my stuff to Lucasfilm, and they read my books and thought, oh, well, he's pretty good. Let's ask him if he wants to do it. And so Timothy Zahn was the first person that came out with the trilogy. I was the second person.
wow.
And I loved it. I mean, I loved Star Wars, and I spent from that point on, I went to Skywalker Ranch a whole bunch of times. I met George Lucas. I worked on comics and anthologies and novels and a young adult series, and I don't know at this point, but at most of the time, at least, I was nobody else had written more Star Wars projects than I had, and maybe somebody's past that. I haven't worked for Lucasfilm since like 2004 or something like. I mean, I've got the Dune stuff and my own things, and it's kind of taken off. And people keep writing me, "Why don't you write more Star Wars books?" And I go, "Yeah, but when I was the one writing them all, I could keep up with it, and now there's like 700 other things that I have to keep up with." So
yeah,
I'm happy working on the Dune movies and my own books and all kinds of stuff.
you poor thing. You're only just working on the Dune movies and your own books right now. I don't know how you get by with just that.
Well, and a few other things too. And
how was the leap from writing your own original stuff to writing stuff in an existing universe? What was the difference there for you?
I grew up as a fanboy. I mean, I was always watching Star Trek and Space 1999 and Outer Limits, and so I was always just deep into the stuff. And I read Lord of the Rings, and as a fan, you're already like, you believe you're part of this universe, that this is something you enjoy, that's what you work with. So when I got asked to write the Star Wars stuff, then I immediately began my research, which meant I watched the movies over and over again. I built a model of the Millennium Falcon. I bought my Boba Fett action figures so I could play with them, and they're all write-offs, of course, because it was research material. And again, at the time, I was one of the first people doing it, so there wasn't a gigantic backlog of things for me to catch up on. But I get the question a lot about, how can you write in somebody else's universe? And every time you write, you're writing in a universe. And if I were to write a novel set in ancient Japan, I would have to do my research about what was ancient Japan all about. What is the geography like? What's the history like? How do they dress? And what weapons do they use? And what do they eat? And what's their culture? In order to convey, like Shogun. If I was writing a book like Shogun, there's a ton of research I'd have to do. I don't live in ancient Japan. I have to create that universe in my imagination to write the book. Well, it's the same process to write a Star Wars book, I have to dive into the Star Wars universe and understand all the alien races and the politics and the star systems and the planets and the characters. And it's a little bit easier because I can just watch the movies over and over again and really pick up the vibe. If I'm going to write, I mean, I have always wanted to write in like the Russian history version of Shogun, but that would take decades of research, and I don't know that I can spend that much time. So you always, as a writer, you create a universe, and in Star Wars or Dune or X-Files or whatever, you just do your research and you do your best to convey the look and feel so that when somebody reads a Kevin Anderson Star Wars book, it feels like they're putting a new Star Wars TV show on TV or something.
Now, when you're writing with Lucasfilm, I guess Disney wasn't involved at this point.
No, this was just Lucasfilm.
You just send, they give you an idea of what they want. You send an outline. How does that process work?
Well, this was at the time, so I don't know how they do it now. But at the time, they just said, "Okay, Kevin, do it. We want you to do a trilogy. What have you got?" And they had me pitch things to them, and they basically picked two ideas that I really liked, and I intertwined those into my Jedi Academy trilogy. And because it's Lucasfilm, they have to approve everything. So I as a writer, am a full outline person. I want to make very detailed outlines. In chapter 1, this happens. Chapter 2, this happens. So that makes it easier when you're working for Lucasfilm, because if you're what they call as a pantser, if you're just making it up as it goes along and hope it comes together, it's really hard to get that approved ahead of time. So that was good for me to learn how to just, here's my detailed outline, and Lucasfilm would either approve it or ask me to change something. And sometimes they would make me change something because they had a different toy coming out and they wanted me to feature this instead of that. And but you're a writer, you do that. And in fact, you can understand that better than some of my more literary writer friends, because as a script writer, if you're writing a TV script for Law and Order, well, you need to know how Law and Order works, and you write a script to order. You don't, or if you're writing a Star Trek Next Generation script, you don't go, well, I'm a fancy writer and I'm not going to write a bald Captain Picard. I'm going to write, I mean, you play by the rules. You're working on somebody else's universe. So, and that's the way it goes. And then I would write it and they would see the manuscript and, make some changes or correct things, but not too bad. It was really a pretty easy thing. And I've worked for a lot of different IPs, and it all kind of depends on the personalities at the top. Some are really, really protective, and some are like, well, as long as it feels right, go. And I've done that. Used to be a huge part of my income. That part of publishing has kind of faded away. There used to be what they call a novelization, the paperback book of the movie that comes out. Yeah. Like if a movie, what's out, like Marvels just came out last week. I don't know, but I doubt that there's a paperback book called Marvels that's in your grocery store or 7-Eleven, but there always used to be. And that was a good writing gig for writers. They would send you the script and you would turn it into a novel, and it would take you 3 weeks and you get a decent paycheck for it. But that, I guess, because movies appear on streaming so fast, nobody needs to have the book with them anymore.
Right. No. Years ago, I was developing some IP. It was a book about stars as characters and a story about them and whatnot. And I remember the production company we were working with brought in a toy consultant because it was a kids project. Mm-hmm. And there were primary female stars. And they're like, where's the male stars? And we're like, well, there's no male stars in this story. Yeah, well, there's no male stars. That's half your toy market. And it was interesting how that whole psychology affected the IP, because in the IP there weren't really any boy stars, but then we had to start redeveloping it with that as well. And it's a business. People don't realize how much of a business it is when you're developing these projects. So that's fascinating. So you wrote how many Star Wars books?
Well, 54 total, but some of those were comics and graphic novels, and I wrote 2 pop-up books. My wife and I did a whole series, 14 volumes of Young Jedi Knights. That was our best-selling, award-winning young adult series, and we still get people coming up to us that book, that series changed their lives because they were reading it in high school, and these were like dysfunctional kids trying to figure out what to do, and it was just like what real kids were. Um, we have people come up with that they've named their children after characters in those books, and that's just kind of cool. So
That's amazing. What's the difference between writing a graphic novel, a novel, or a comic book?
well, comic book is usually just the monthly 22 page, they're called flippies, the little magazine sized things. And sometimes, and I've done a bunch of these, that you just do a long 6-issue story arc and they collect those 6 issues into a volume. So that's like a graphic novel. But I've also written, in fact, one of my biggest ones is Brian Herbert and I did Dune, the graphic novel, where we took Frank Herbert's novel and did a scene by scene adaptation of the novel into a comic format. And those are in 3 big volumes from Abrams Books. That was a New York Times bestseller, won some awards. It just got named one of the top 100 graphic novels of all time. So did pretty well. But what the insight was really interesting because I revere that novel so much, and it is such a classic that, unlike filmmakers who decide that they're going to take a great work and just do their own thing with it, we actually felt we didn't want to improve or adapt Frank Herbert's book. We wanted to actually just do the way Frank wrote it, and scene by scene, what the novel is. And the learning experience, because I'm sure you know, because it's pretty classic and legendary, that Dune is one of these really hard books to film.
Yeah.
And they've been trying for so long, and it's the legendary movie that just came out a couple of years ago. That was the 3rd one. There was the David Lynch one that came out in 1984, I think, and there was a Sci-Fi Channel miniseries that was 2000 and something, 3 or 4, and then the big one with Timothy Chalamet and Jason Momoa. That's the 3rd attempt, and writing this graphic novel adaptation of it really showed me that that's a very, very difficult book to adapt visually, because the first 80 pages are all world building and cerebral stuff and explaining how the politics works and what's happening. And for those people familiar with Dune, maybe it hasn't occurred to you, but the major emotionally intense, the major action scene in the first 80 pages is Paul sticks his hand in a box and everything goes in his mind. I mean, that's a very intense scene where he's got his hand and she's Reverend Mother Mohayam has the poison needle to his neck, and he can't take his hand out of the box, and the pain is getting worse and worse, but he can't see anything. But that's all psychological stuff. If you're showing it, it's not a very action-packed scene. Some kid with his hand in a box and he can't move. So our graphic novel is our interpretation of it, and Denis Villeneuve did a very good job of it in Dune Part One, I think, conveying everything. But Dune, the novel, doesn't open with a starship exploding and then a war happening and all kinds of stuff. It's a slow burn until they get to the planet Arrakis, and then things start happening.
It was interesting, having just watched the movie again last night. I hadn't seen it since it first came out. And I will admit, when it first came out, I had a hard time kind of keeping up with everything because there's so much world building that's going on in so many terms. And I had the subtitles on last night, so that really helped me. I could read what they were saying, because there was a lot of unfamiliar words that are being said. And that scene that you're talking about, where he puts his hand in the box, was actually incredibly intense for me last night. And I think he portrayed that through Rebecca Ferguson's reactions, when you see the mother reacting to what he's going through and how it's just destroying her. It just made it so much more impactful. And I thought it was Denny has this way of creating something without spectacle that is incredibly powerful. I think he did it with Arrival. I think he did it again with Dune, and the movie just hit me in a whole different way. And
Well, and when you read that scene in the book, I mean, you're on the edge of your seat. It's like it's very intense, but a movie has to convey it in a different way. And I thought they did a great job of it. But that just really, when I was writing the comic adaptation of it, it's like, well, what do I show here? He's just sitting there, and it's a challenge. But
so when you are writing a comic, what's the difference format wise? You're just writing text of what they're saying, and then you're describing an image.
Well, a comic script is the closest thing to a film or TV show script. I mean, it literally is page one, panel one, describe the panel, put the dialogue in, and then panel two, describe the panel, put the dialogue in, panel three, describe the panel. So it's like writing a movie script for a slideshow, if that makes any sense, because comics are visual, but they're one frame at a time.
Right.
And it has to be compact, because especially if you're doing a monthly comic, you have 22 pages, period. You don't get to go over. It's not like streaming where your hour show can maybe be 70 minutes if you need it. No, right. It's like old network, you were 50 minutes or 60 minutes of commercials and all this stuff. It actually had to follow a very rigid format. And even more on a comic book, like especially Dune, because Dune is big and visual, and also my Star Wars stuff. You like to do these beautiful 2-page spreads to show all of the artwork, the starship coming in. Well, think about it. The 2-page spread actually has to start with an even numbered page on the left side and an odd numbered page on the right side. So if you're writing a script and go 2-page spread, you got to make sure that you've staged it so that you can have a 2-page spread, because 2-page spread, you have to turn the page for it, doesn't work. So it's a cool, I mean, it's a skill that you have to do, but I grew up reading comics like crazy. So it's kind of natural for me.
How many comics have you written?
100 or so. I mean, I've written Doctor Strange, I've written Justice Society, Batman, Superman, Predator, X-Files, lots of Star Wars. I like writing comics. It's a lot faster than writing a novel.
Oh,
so, well, and as you may have noticed, I like to have different irons in the fire, because one year the novels might take off, and the next year the publisher might fold, and I have to get money from comics, or 7 years might go by and the TV show still isn't made, so I have to make my money elsewhere, because a lot of these things, you might get the option, or you might get something, and there's a lot of money in that contract, but you don't get any of it until they actually start filming. And as you might know, they never actually start filming. So, well, and here's another thing that frustrates me is right now I've got a lot of interest in my stuff. I've got all kinds of people. I've got a manager, I've got a film attorney, I got all these people that, we love this and we want to do this. And they don't even want to do options anymore. They want to do shopping agreements, which means they want it for free. That, I'm a big producer and I love your stuff, and I'm going to, insert long, enthusiastic, gushing thing, but I'm going to make a $300 million movie out of this, but I can't afford $2,000 to pay for an option. And that always makes me question a little bit, like, well, if you can't get $2,000 to pay for it, then how do you get the $300 million? But that's the business. And I have a lot of that going on in the background, and I just don't obsess on it. I will be delighted if I get a phone call saying, hey, we actually did start filming, so you can pay your house off now. But we never go, I'm counting on that money to pay the bills, because more often than not, it won't come. And
that's the nature of the business. Earlier this spring, I got asked to write a Christmas movie that we're shooting this coming Christmas, but they got behind on a bunch of stuff. The strike, of course, jacked things up, and now they're like, yeah, we don't need that script till next year, and so they're going to film it next year now. And it's just the nature of the way things go, and it's an odd industry that we work in. There's no two ways about that.
Yeah.
But
But if you didn't have optimism, you would not be in this career in the first place. You always, it's everything that I do reminds me of Charlie Brown and the football, that you're always like hoping that maybe Lucy won't pull it away this time. And it just again and again. And that's why I'm glad that I have my publishing career. I'm glad I have a stable job at the university, which is another like monthly paycheck. That there's just so many unpredictable things in this business that I advocate that you have lots of different income streams rather than just banking everything on this one script is really going to make it big. And well, okay, but you need to survive long enough to get there.
Absolutely. No, that was the original thought process for me when I started teaching myself as a college professor. I'm like, I'll have the expenses kind of covered and I'll have health insurance, but I'll still have my summers off to go make movies and whatnot. And somewhere along the line, I fell in love with teaching. So now it's two sides to that coin that I get to enjoy, as do you. But I think your coin has like 12 sides to it.
It's like a 20-sided dice instead of a coin. So,
so you told me that they're filming the Sisterhood series. And
as far as we know, remember, we're just the writer creative consultant, so they don't necessarily tell us. And Legendary sends out their press releases when they have things to say, but we look at scripts and it's been cast and they're filming stuff. So, but I don't know when it'll come out.
Don't know the details. Okay, I won't get too far into that. But one of the things that I mentioned with your intro is that you were creating a gaming universe with Alien Worlds. Can you tell me a little bit about that project and what that entails and how it came about?
Well, what I do, my secret superpower is that I'm a really good world builder, that I've done giant science fiction epics and fantasy epics and working on the Star Wars stuff. And I've even written a teaching book and I give seminars on world building. So I'm really good at creating immersive alien planets or fantasy worlds and whatever, and developing magic systems or space travel systems and interstellar commerce and all that. And I had a large gaming company, and one of the people is a fan of mine. They have this interactive multiverse that they've got millions of players that are on a bunch of alien planets, and they had been building it themselves sort of as a cooperative thing for many years. And it's very well established, but they kind of got to a point where they needed somebody to put up guardrails and to define things better. And so they brought me, the company's called DeCoco. They brought me like, here's what we've been working on, and can you fix this? And I looked at it, and I have to say my first response, I said, I'm not sure I can fix this. There's so many contradictory things in it. But I really dug into it, and they gave me lots of freedom. And I spent about a year and a half creating the whole overall economic system and the basic conflicts and different alien races and planets. And we really started developing, oh, this one's so cool. And this whole culture, we would run off with it. And I built like a very vast canvas that is going to be this whole Alien Worlds multiverse game. Now, when I'm just thinking of this now, and it's a really cool thing. When I was a kid, we had my parents had gotten me like this. It's like a rug that we would unfold, and the rug was like a city, had all kinds of streets and buildings and things. And we would unfold that rug and take out our toys, and we would play with our cars and everything on this rug that was basically a town landscape, and we would just play there for hours on it. Well, I sort of created this rug for all the people in this multiverse to be playing with, and they just made the big press release announcement last week, and it's glad that I don't have to keep it secret anymore, because this is a pretty cool thing. And now my stuff is going to be fed into this huge computer gaming universe. And kind of the irony is that I'm not a huge computer gamer myself, because when do I have the time to spend hours working on games? But I'm a world builder, and I created a lot of stuff that now other people can play in these worlds and have their own adventures, and I just think that's pretty cool.
Did that fit right in with what you have been doing, or was there some growth or expansion for you in this process?
Um, well, I don't ever like to do the same old thing, and I had to learn a whole lot of stuff about this is like millions of people in interactive cooperative societies with, I mean, this is in the game. And I had to learn how to, instead of me just being the guy who wrote the book, this is stuff that has to be developed and in cooperation with lots of other people who are very passionate about this game. And it seems to have made the announcement, it seems to have made some really good waves in the industry. So it's a game changer with quotes around it. So
Okay, well, that's exciting. It's fascinating that you get to work in so many different areas, and yet the same skill set seems to apply.
I mean, really, world building for this computer game is the same as world building for a fantasy series. I tell novel stories with it, and these people will be playing interactive games with it.
Mhm. Well, speaking of the writing process, where do you start when you're working with an idea? Is it conceptual? Is it character based? Like, what's the jumping off point for an idea for a story for you? And then to follow that up, what's the point at which you know you're ready to start writing?
Kind of depends on each project. I mean, the glib answer is I get inspired when I get an assignment, and the inspiration point is when the deadline is. But that's a little bit different. I have so many ideas running around in my head. I try to map out like a year in advance. In general, I write 3, maybe 4 novels a year. That's just what I do. I like to think of it as a project, like a fantasy trilogy will be 3 books. And I like to, okay, it's going to be this. And I have a general sketch of what the trilogy is. But then I really dive into the world building, where I'll go out and try to figure out like the different kingdoms or something, or the different characters. And I will have some major plot points in my head. This is the big battle in the climax for book 1, or this is the giant tragedy that happens that launches the war in chapter 1, or something like that. And as I develop that, it's almost an interactive, as the world building builds, that gives me ideas for characters. And then I do the character background, and they give me the ideas for how to set up the politics. And for the king dies and there's a war of succession. Well, I need to know how succession works. Is it only the firstborn male? Is it daughters as well? Is it a trial by combat? Is it a elder council that figures out who's the next best leader? I mean, and then that makes me develop the whole political system before I can write the story about the war of succession. And it's all almost like it's like a balloon I have, that you push your finger in one direction, it pops out a different direction, and then you push it back and something else sticks out. And I like to do all my world building before I outline the characters, and then I outline the whole framework chapter by chapter. And but when I say I'm an outliner, that the chapter is there's a big battle between sailing ships and the port burns at the end. That's my outline. So there's still lots of room for me to be creative when I write that chapter, but there are still bullet points, or I have lines that I can color inside.
Okay, so you like to discover during the writing process too.
Well, I discover the details, but I know the roadmap. Like if you're taking a cross country drive, I think you should look at a map first. And sure, you can stop to see the giant ball of string if it interests you on your way by, or you can stop at a local eatery if you want lunch or something like that. But if I'm trying to get to Phoenix, Arizona, from Denver, I want to know the route to get from Denver to Phoenix.
Yep.
I don't understand these writers that are just, well, I'm going to get in the car and just drive and hope I get to Phoenix someday. I don't even know north or south, but I'm going to go somewhere and see what happens. But
I love that.
planning as well.
I love that analogy. That's one I often use. I'm like, you got to know your destination before you start this process, because if you
Yeah.
don't, you're just going to be driving around in circles. Absolutely.
Well, and driving from Denver to Phoenix, there are several different routes, and there might be little scenic country roads, or there might be the interstate, and you can choose your different ways. But I want to at least have a map so I know where I'm going. And
No, I concur
especially
wholeheartedly.
if you're working with co-authors, it's really good that you and your co-author both have the same map, so you know where you're going.
That's right. You've written a lot with a bunch of different co-authors.
Oh, lots with co-authors, and we both have the same outline. And I mean, Brian Herbert, it's been 24 novels I've written with him, I think, and I've written 34 with my wife Rebecca, and we have an outline, and we both, you can write your own chapter as long as the start and the end is where you're assigned to have, because it's got to match up with what I wrote in the next chapter.
So when you're writing with a partner, do both of you actually do the writing? Because
Oh yeah, oh
people have
yeah.
a different way of saying stuff. Then how do you go out and make
Well,
sure it's got one voice to it?
Well, in my main collaborations, we both, like, Brian writes half of the chapters in every Dune book,
Hmm.
and my wife Rebecca writes half of the chapters in all of our Young Jedi Knights books and things. I mean, we plot it together, we outline it, so we both have the same book in our heads, and then we write it, and one of us takes the Word document of the completed manuscript, and we just plow through it and rewrite. That's our real key, is that there's no track changes, there's no redlined manuscript, because if you don't trust your co-author, you shouldn't be working with them.
Hmm.
And Brian Herbert will give me all of his chapters for a Dune book. I will stitch them all together into one big Word document, and I will go through from page 1 to page whatever 500, and I'll just rewrite anything that I don't like. If he writes a sentence that doesn't sound like me, I'll fix it. No, we're not going to throw out chapters or rewrite the plot, because we've agreed on that already.
Right.
But descriptions of things, I'll add things and describe it and rewrite some of the sentences. And then when I'm done, I send him a clean manuscript, no markings on it.
Mm-hmm.
He just gets draft 2, and here's your Word file. And then Brian goes through it and rewrites anything he doesn't like, or anything he doesn't think sounds like his prose. And then it goes back to me, and I do the same thing, and goes through 5 drafts, 6 drafts, depending on whatever we do. And by the time it's done, that prose is seamless. You can't tell what I wrote, and you can't tell what he wrote.
Hmm.
And
That's
we've
awesome.
done that successfully. And well, if you take my wife's stuff, I have another thriller co-author, Doug Beeson. We've done 13 books together. I mean, what is that? 60 some books I've written together with people. And, it turns out pretty well.
That's awesome. So when you are laying out the 4 books for next year, are 3 of them going to be like a trilogy? So you're kind of in the same world, or could it just be
Now,
all over the place?
now there'll be one is a big hard science fiction colonization on Alpha Centauri story called Persephone. I just did a big Kickstarter on that. And I have this series that I just love to death about a zombie, Dan Shamble zombie PI. And that's my guy. It's sort of like The Naked Gun meets the Addams Family. And I've written 9 of those books already, and I'll probably write book 10 next year. Trying to figure out I've got several other things that I have in mind. And it just sort of depends on my travel schedule or what I'm doing. I might do another collaboration with Brian Herbert, because we just did a Dune book that just came out, but we don't have another one on tap yet, but we might come up with one of those. My career is so full of opportunities right now that I'm trying to keep a little bit of elbow room, because something's going to come up that's so neat that I'll have to stop it. I'm meeting with a friend of mine who's a major guy in the financial tech industry. He has a podcast with millions of listeners, and he's flying in from Thailand because he wants to pitch an idea to me and see if we want to work on this science fiction thing together. I have no idea what it's about, so I'll keep an open mind and see what he has. So, and I've got graphic novels coming up and monthly comics I'm doing, and keeps my plate pretty full, but I'm eating as fast as I can to make room for dessert.
Well, there are many of us who would love to be in your shoes, sir. So congratulations on that.
Thanks.
Let me ask you one question. Give me something, you put your teacher hat on for a second. And, we have a lot of people that are trying to become professional writers who listen to our podcast. What are one or two points of advice that you would give to these people who are trying to build their careers?
Well, never stop learning. I mean, I'm constantly absorbing other movies, TV shows. I'm reading comics. I'm reading other novels. And I read outside of my genre because that's where you learn stuff.
Mm-hmm.
That if I'm writing fantasy quest adventures, I don't just read fantasy quest adventures because then you're just then recycling. So read a lot, learn a lot, work every day. There's no such thing as a vacation. You're exercising your muscles. An Olympic swimmer doesn't just say, I'm taking the month off. They work out every day and keep themselves in shape. And you need to do that with your creative muscles. And it goes back to the learning, at least in publishing. This business it's in this constant flux. And I spend half of my time just trying to learn, well, what changed last week, and what publisher went out of business, and what new technology did Amazon come up with, and how do I make better covers, and there's a new layout software that I need to learn, and you don't get to be a writer who lives in a cabin in the mountains and just write a book and expect somebody else to do all the rest of the work for you. Mm-hmm. You now have to be a one person band doing everything instead of, early in my career, I could write the book and send it to the publisher and they did most everything. And that's just not the case anymore. And it's exhausting. And I would love to just be resting on my laurels and writing a book or two a year just because I want to, but too much good stuff. But it is fun and I'm enjoying it. So
when I was first starting out, I was looking for my Coen brother. I'm like, who's that person that I'm going to work with that's going to do the stuff that I don't want to do? And after a few years of waiting around, I remember one morning I was brushing my teeth, looking in the mirror, and I was like, oh, that's my Coen brother in the mirror. And that's when I had to learn how to,
Yep.
raise money and how to create a private placement memorandum and do film accounting and do all the stuff that I never really had a stomach for. But that allowed my career to move forward because I was able to do the other stuff that I didn't want to do, that I think most creatives don't want to do.
It's your job. I mean, that's what a lot of writers don't realize is, doctors don't get doctor's block and lawyers don't get lawyer's block. That is their job. They got to do it. And there are parts of this that I love and there are parts that I don't love. But if I had a 40-hour-a-week job working at a retail store, there'd be a lot of that I don't like too. And most people have to do that. So writers aren't special. They have to do things that they might not want to do.
That was beautifully said. I think that fantastic advice. I thank you for your time. Continued success to you, sir. And looking forward to what you do next.
Well, thank you. And it's good seeing you again. And let me know a link when you're ready and I'll post it all over my place.
We will.
All right.
Until next time. Thank you so much for watching this video. And as a small token of my appreciation, I want to offer you a free video course on how to outline your screenplay. I normally charge $299 for this course, but for a limited time, it is free. Now, it is a 5-day course, but I'm giving you 7 days to finish this outline, okay? After 7 days, that course goes away. So if you're not dedicated and you don't want to knock out a killer outline for your screenplay, don't do it. But if you do, click the link below. I can't wait to hear how you like it.